Welcome to our LBW EducateU podcast. Today, our special guest is Leigh Bagwell. And Leigh and I have known each other for many years and have worked together in various capacities. And I just realized I failed to introduce myself. I'm Tamara with Love in a Big World. And we are so excited to have this conversation today, given the fact that our kids are experiencing so much need, given the pandemic and all the related issues, the questions and controversies around politics and equity. And we're dealing with a lot nationally, internationally, and our kids are feeling it all. And if you've looked at the research, you know that they're experiencing increased levels of anxiety and depression, and even suicide ideation and suicide itself. So this is a very timely conversation. So Leigh, welcome. Would you give us a little bit of background about who you are and what you're up to?
Sure. I just want to thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to you and hopefully provide some support and some ideas on how folks can help better support our students because you're right, they are suffering. A little bit about me. So I am gosh, like you said, history, we go way back. I started as a school counselor several decades ago, and then worked in various schools in Middle Tennessee, and then got to be a counselor supervisor in a couple different districts in Middle Tennessee. And after about 15 years of doing that, I went to the State Department of Education as the director of school counseling services. And through those experiences, really had an opportunity to learn a lot about our students and what they're experiencing, and learn a lot about how particularly school counselors can be a huge lever in getting them access and opportunities to the support that they need. I am currently a PhD candidate. I came back to my alma mater at the University of Tennessee to get my PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision. I finished all my coursework and I'm working on my dissertation and hope to be doctorly by the fall. So that's a little bit about my story.
That's awesome. And I believe in you. I've already called you Dr. Leigh, and you've been quick to correct me and say, not yet, Tamara.
Not yet, yes.
Not yet. But we will celebrate when that day comes.
Yes, we will.
So let's start with some of the reasons why our students are facing increased anxiety. I know I mentioned some of the factors around the pandemic, but I know that there's much more than just this current trauma that we're facing collectively. What are the things that you've discovered or experienced that our kids are facing?
You're exactly right. So yeah, the obvious right now is just the pandemic and what it's done to their daily life. In addition to, the fear and the concern about their health, it has had a huge impact on how our students are learning and how they're engaging in what was a very normal structure in their life. And so just that shifting to a different format of learning in and of itself, that change we've certainly seen students kind of show an increase in anxiety in the change alone. And I think with that, because the K-12 system was kind of caught, like, we don't really know how we're going to do this, there were not a lot of supports in place for students who were learning virtually. And what I mean by that is just thinking about the day-to-day work. How do I access lessons? How do I get the information? What do I do if I have questions? What do I do if I'm on my own, if, my guardians are at work and I have to get myself up for the class? And, not shockingly, some of our students don't like to get up real early in the morning and they miss class. And how do we navigate that academic world? We also have a lot of students that, and you are certainly aware of this, that are looking to finish up high school. And so all of those kind of traditional benchmark activities that they look forward to, they've lost those, and they've not been, at first they weren't replaced immediately. So there was this kind of unknownness about how they did their work. I think also a huge part of what our kids are experiencing is the lack of social connection. And not, we've got social media, and certainly there are a lot of good things and bad things that could happen with social media. I'm not one that thinks social media is wrong. I think it's how we utilize social media that can have really positive outcomes and some challenging outcomes. But I think our students lost that daily connection with peers, with trusted adults in their school. And so all of that kind of created this sense of unknown. What we know about anxiety is that it's rooted in fear. And when we don't know what's happening, like that creates a fear in us. And if our kids don't have the skills that they need to navigate that and to kind of handle that fear, then it just increases the level of anxiety that they're going to face. So those are a few things. I think we also see a lot of kids that we have access to so much now. So there's this constant state of comparison. Not only, when I was in school, and you too, I'll throw you in that boat with me, like once we got home from school, like people weren't looking at us, people weren't talking to us, we could carry our folded notes around, but that was the extent of it. Nobody else saw those. And so now kids are like 24/7 on all the time, and just not understanding how to navigate that, how to create boundaries for themselves, really adds to that sense of not measuring up. That's again going back to that fear that underlies anxiety. And so I think when we talk about how to help our students who are feeling really anxious, we have to acknowledge like it's coming at them from a lot of different places, and good, bad, or ugly, that is there. We don't need to spend our time debating on the sources of the anxiety. We just need to, for the benefit of our students, to acknowledge that it's there.
So I have to admit that this whole connection between anxiety and fear is somewhat new for me. Mm-hmm. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know, and I became kind of a brain geek in studying this. I did this fall get to put out a book about anxiety. So I feel like I dove in. But what we know about what happens when kids or anyone gets anxious, our brain sees a trigger, something that sparks fear in them, and it's about a fear of safety, and it can be physical safety, emotional safety, social safety, but there's something in it that catches them off guard. And what happens in the brain is the amygdala sees that trigger, and then it responds. So what happens is next is all kind of an automatic. So students aren't really able, and adults for that matter, once this process begins, it's hard to stop because it's all biological. It's all happening. But the amygdala says, oh, hey, there's a threat to something, some kind of safety. And so I'm going to send out these hormones, and some of them include adrenaline, because I need to protect myself. And so what happens, the result of that is what we call the fight, flight, or freeze kind of effect. So we either fight, we recognize that we need to fight off something, or we freeze, we don't move, or we flee, we run away. And until we're able to get to a place of safety again, then we're not able to like have cognitive rational thoughts. And so I liken this to, imagine you go to the zoo, your local zoo, you're there, and you go to the lions and tigers, in that little area. When you see that lion, that big lion, and maybe they growl or the tiger growls, like that could be a threat, right? And so initially we see the tiger and we might go, oh gosh, I need to get away. I don't know who wants to fight a tiger. I mean, I suppose there might be a few, or I need to be really still so that they don't see me, right? And what happens is, for those of us that have learned these skills, we see the tiger, and then we also go, okay, but wait, there's a fence here. Like, there's a barrier. There are zookeepers that are watching. The tiger has been trained. I was given information about coming to a zoo and knowing that the zoo puts things in place to keep me safe. And so all of those things minimize the threat that the amygdala receives. And so that keeps that rush of hormones at bay. And for our kids, when they get that threat, when they feel unsure about something or they feel afraid of, you know, of lots of loss, and we know that kids are experiencing lots of loss right now, if they can't think through, like, and think about being at the zoo and all these things that we have in place, then it's going to trigger that process in their brain and they're just going to be able to react. And that's it.
I really appreciate you breaking it down that way. And then I'm sitting here making the connections to trauma-informed practice and to ACEs. And so it's what I find fascinating is it's just the language that we use to describe these things. We're really talking about the same responses physically and emotionally. It's just the way that you're describing it is, I feel like, the way that lay people can understand it. You know, because sometimes I feel like as educators or experts in a field, we get into practitioner speak, and you're really making it plain for all of us as parents, as educators, as community members. It makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think as one who has experienced a lot of anxiety in her life, like to be able, I had doctors like tell me all the, you know, the things that were happening with the synapses in my brain, like that was over my head. Like I couldn't get all that, but understanding like that this is happening because my body has sensed that something is not right and that I need to listen to that and then learn how to filter it so it doesn't trigger, because once those anxiety attacks start, they don't stop. And I'm not afraid to say I've had anxiety attacks and panic attacks and know that feeling of helplessness because we're on our minds and everything's on autopilot. And so if we can, what I'm passionate about is teaching students, like, what are the skills that we can learn to help filter that threat so that it doesn't send us into that panic moment. Because once the panic starts, researchers said that it takes 20 minutes to 60 minutes for the brain to return to normal. And I think, you know, as I think about how educators can help and even parents, understanding that calling out a student like right when something is happening, they're not going to be able to respond to you. No. Their brains absolutely will not allow them. And I've seen it and I've done it. Like, talk to me. Well, they can't because they're in a panic mode. They're survival, much like what we have learned about those students who've experienced trauma. And you're exactly right.
Well, and I'm also seeing a lot of connections when you talk about kids and adults needing to de-escalate before they can really process what has happened. That connection to attachment theory. And you mentioned a few moments ago that when you're in that state of anxiety or panic, you have to get back to a safe place to really be able to talk about it. And if you're familiar, I'm sure you are, with attachment theory, if others are, that was, as an adoptive mom, that was one of the key pieces that helped me understand my kids and helped me understand that when a situation escalated, it wasn't personal, right? It was their thing that they were dealing with. And my job was to stay calm so that they could feel safe returning back to me. And then we could figure it out together. Yeah. And that's one of the things that when I'm working with educators, I'm continually reminding all of us of. And there's that mantra that you might know. It's like, I am bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. And just the social worker that taught me this, he was like, if you need to repeat that 1,000 times a day, just do it, because that self-talk really helps me stay calm and stay out of that place of anxiety so that I can be the safe place for my kids.
Well, and in some of the research I did, I came across a great video of students talking about their experiences and what they wanted the adults in their lives to know. You know, I'm not choosing to be anxious. You know, I'm not intentionally being disobedient. I'm not looking for attention. I need help, but this is not just to get attention. I'm not trying to avoid doing work. Like, it's not, if you've ever had an anxiety attack or a panic attack, it's not fun. It's not something you want to do for kicks, right? Because your body is just moving and your brain is of no help to you in terms of cognitively. So I think it's really important for the adults to understand, like, our kids want us to help, but we need to give them the space to be able to communicate and not assume that it's all a show or that they're trying to get out of something. Because even if it is a perceived fear, it still creates a real impact. The anxiety is real. And so, if it's something that you or I would be okay with, but a child reacts differently, it's still very real for that child. So we need to honor that and meet them there to bring them back to be able to process and make them know that they are safe, and then teach them the skills to help them the next time.
That's so good. So what are some of the warning signs that we can watch for in our students?
So I think, in terms of not necessarily getting ready to have a panic attack, but in terms of that building anxious state that our students are under, I think noticing withdrawal or disengagement. If students are feeling overwhelmed and that there's so much happening, then they're going to remove themselves from what they feel like they can. And for them, that's a safe strategy. So they're not being quiet to be annoying. It's that's the strategy they know to quiet the noise in their head. I think we also see students with lots of anger and tantrums. A lot of times students that are anxious, it can look like ADHD. And so being able to know that when we see some of those distracted behaviors, like, we might need to dig in a little bit. A quote I ran across that has stuck with me is, a worried brain is a distracted brain. Mm. So particularly for our educators, if our kids aren't staying, paying attention in class, if they're having trouble attending, then there likely is something happening in their head. There are physical symptoms, that can manifest themselves. Obviously, I think people familiar with racing hearts, shallow breaths, red face, those kinds of things, but also, stomach aches, headaches, poor sleep, significant changes in habits, whether it's, hygiene habits or even, how they engage at home with their siblings. Those types of changes can be signals that, hey, our kids might need a little help. I think we have to remember, especially for our young kiddos, they don't have the vocabulary to communicate what's happening to them. And so for the adults, we really have to be aware and watch for those changes. And not every single example is going to mean that your students are anxious, but that's where we as adults can do a little probing and a little talking with them just to check in and make sure that they're doing okay.
So many of the indicators that you're mentioning are similar to indicators for suicide ideation or some depression. Do you find that to be true, that they're similar?
I do. There is a connection between anxiety and suicidal ideation, and even self-harm is another topic that I've been looking at lately. Self-harm is seen as a strategy to deal with those feelings. So if students are starting to cut or to harm themselves, and that can take a lot of, different forms. When students are feeling like there is no other option, a lot of times they talk about that overwhelming feeling of anxiety, and it's that constant being on guard. So imagine if you led your life constantly in fear that a tiger was going to attack you. Like, that's a lot to carry.
Yes.
So you can see how students get to that place where they're like, I just need an escape. And this is the only thing I know.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, we have a lot of students that do attempt and complete suicide, um, which is heartbreaking for
Yeah.
any student to get to that point.
So, what are some supports that we as educators, family members, community members can put into place for our students to help them with their anxiety?
So one, I think things like this is great. We've got to start being okay with talking about it. Awareness, helping students, I mentioned a minute ago, not having the vocabulary. So teaching them about anxiety, about mental wellness. I think that in my perfect world, we would teach students very intentionally about their mental health and how to stay mentally well. We focus a lot on physical health, but how are we empowering them to be in control and maintain their mental health? So talking about it, I think trying to create spaces that students feel safe. And for adults, we have to understand that safe is defined differently for different students, and is often different than we as adults. So we have to be willing to step out of what we know and learn, what do our students need? What do our kids need to feel safe? What does that look like? Helping to build their, their emotional literacy. How do they know how to communicate about their feelings? A lot of that's kind of prevention, foundational work, but I think it's really important, because I'm a big believer in prevention. And if we could invest a lot of time and energy in the prevention side, then that's going to help on the intervention side. So in terms of intervention, I think watching our students and being observant when there are things that seem a little different. And I think knowing students and knowing what the kinds of things they're dealing with is really important. Back in the fall, I had an opportunity to do a 5-week interim as a freshman high school counselor at a high school here in Knoxville, which it's been a long time since I was in the school, and I loved it for a lot of reasons. But even just being in students' presence and